So welcome all of you in the fourth lecture of our series, The Future of Classical Education. And today our speaker is Dr. Edmund Stewart from the University of Nottingham. He is assistant professor in ancient Greek history, and he has published in the various areas of the history of Greek literature, Greek drama, Greek religion, as well as economic history, sociology, ancient Greek politics. Dr. Stewart is the author of the monograph Greek Tragedy on the Move, The Birth of a Pan-Hellenic Art Form, published with Oxford University Press in 2017, as well as he co-edited with Edward Harris, among others, a volume Skilled Labor and Professionalism in Ancient Greece and Rome, published with Cambridge University Press in 2020. He's also published a couple of articles on the ancient concept of tyranny and the tyrant. For instance, an article, The Tyrant's Progress, the Meaning of the Tyrannos in Plato and Aristotle, published in the journal Polis in 2021. And Dr. Stewart was also a founder of an interdisciplinary network called Tyrannica, which is dedicated to the study of the concept of tyranny, both in antiquity and in contemporary world. And I have a pleasure to collaborate with Edmund on these issues. And Edmund is also one of the editors and founders of Antigone, the greatest online journal popularizing ancient culture. And that today's talk is entitled Professions, Professionalism, and the Challenge of Bureaucracies, a Platonic Perspective. So, Edmund, we're all ears. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's always a great pleasure to work with Mateusz on this project. Well, we've been working much more closely on the issue of tyranny, and I, of course, from a more sort of ancient historical perspective, and Mateusz is very much on the philosophy. But today I'm going to do something slightly different, which is to talk a little bit about, well, some aspects of philosophy. Now, he knows that I'm something of an amateur in this field, so I hope he will forgive me and hope you will forgive me as well. But what I'd like to talk about is expertise and knowledge. And I think that there are a number of modern problems in the modern workplace associated with expertise and knowledge. We have in the modern world, and by the modern world I mean the developed world, in what might be called the West or Europe, parts of Asia and America, we have a knowledge society or a knowledge economy. And this has involved in increasing specialization through the division of labor in the modern economy, increasing professionalization as individual occupations move towards greater accreditation, greater training, and developing a what might be called a professional set of values and identity. But it's also been driven by an explosion in university education, far beyond which has grown the quote professional sector or professional class far beyond the size of what it had previously been. And this has led to a fierce competition within the knowledge economy. Much of this competition is zero sum. We are seeing professionalized workers, professionalized sectors who are gaining in terms of rewards, in terms of pay, in terms of status over their less professionalized colleagues. This is resulting in substantial costs. The costs of professions are growing, but it's also resulting, strangely, in de-skilling. It's resulting in some ways in a loss of knowledge and loss of skill, as the focus is increasingly on higher order academic skills versus practical experience. So that's the first problem. The second problem is, away from the workplace, the place of the expert or expertise in the wider political world. So this is the world of the political forum, if you like, of the democratic state. And there is in many countries a stress on democracy caused by the dominance of, quotes, experts. These are often referred to as technocrats. And in many fields and areas associated, for example, with climate change, with mass vaccination, with or indeed any technical or educational areas, we're finding the demos is complaining of the domination of these overreaching experts. In my country, Britain, this was particularly clear during the process in which we left the European Union, for example, in which the party of Remain, the party that wanted to keep Britain within the European Union, very much positioned itself as the party of the experts, and it lost. And that tells you something about perhaps the decline in status in some ways of the expert in our communities. And finally, the final problem I'd like to talk about is a crisis in the professions. And this is a crisis which is found in many sectors of the traditional professions, in medicine, in law, but particularly in our own profession, in the universities. The universities is, of course, where professionals are created, but we are also finding much the same crisis happening here. So that brings me to the relevance of this overall topic to the overall question of this seminar series or lecture series, which was the future of classics. And I think all of these problems are connected to the problem of the future of classics. So I'll be speaking in very broad terms, but actually I believe that they address nonetheless our particular sets of problems. And I hope to be able to draw at the end of this talk some conclusions as to both the problem, what the nature of the problem, and the possible solutions, or perhaps not solutions, but what must be done, whether or not a solution is possible. So the talk has three main parts to it. I'll be first addressing the ancient terms and the ancient concepts. I'm not saying that we will definitely find a solution from going back to Plato and Aristotle, but I would justify going back to Plato and Aristotle because they spent a lot of time thinking about knowledge and a lot of time thinking about skill. So when we're facing similar questions, it's worth hearing what their views might be. But also I think that the concepts that they developed give a certain clarity to a lot of these questions, which is quite often missing from contemporary debates. And then the second part, I will return to our modern dilemmas as I've just outlined them. And in the third part, as I said, I will suggest some conclusions and possible solutions. So to begin, let's go back to the ancient Greeks, to the ancient terms in question. And when we're talking about knowledge, or when we're talking about skill, particularly professional skill, the term that is most important is techne. Now, this as I say, we can translate it as skill, but it has a very broad range of meanings. We might be tempted to think of it as artisanal skill, so that the archetypal techne should be the tectone. But we can see from very early sources, such as Solon, fragment 13, for example, that in actual fact, the craftsman, the artisan, belongs to a broader set of workers, specialist workers, such as the poet, the seer, or the doctor. Which is also clear, of course, from the famous list of demio ergoi in Odyssey, book 17, which is given by Eumaeus. So it's a very broad range of skills, broader potentially than the English profession, which tends in modern English usage to designate only the so-called white-collar, highly skilled professions, not the blue-collar plumbers, carpenters, etc. But then again, even the modern English profession can be quite vague, it can be quite loose in the terms that it can be applied. And this is also true of techne. Techne is an ideal type. So there are a number of what we might call family resemblances, which we can use to categorize certain practices as skills, as techni. And very briefly, these criteria are it has to be a form of knowledge. It has to not just be knowledge, but it is specialist knowledge. And this has come about due to the division of labor, a concept outlined most famously by Adam Smith at the opening of his Wealth of Nations. But Adam Smith was almost certainly drawing on his knowledge of the same concept as it was outlined in Plato and Xenophon. The third criterion, if you like, or characteristic, as I might say, is that the techne has an end, it has a function. The Greek word, of course, is ergon. And that function is of benefit to society. So technitae, much as modern professionals, they have what sociologists call a service orientation. They have an aim to benefit their clients or benefit their students or patients. The work is not the end in itself. The fifth point is that techne, the technical knowledge, can be assessed, it must be demonstrated, it can be proven. And of course, if you can demonstrate knowledge, you can also teach it. So the sixth point is that it must be teachable. If you can't teach it, you clearly don't understand it. In the same way, if you can't explain it or can't show it, you don't understand it. The seventh point is that it requires experience, at least experience, habituation, to be able to turn the layman into the expert, into the technites. And preferably also, because we're dealing with knowledge and professional knowledge, we need a program of training. It's also a full-time occupation, so it's not just basic training and then giving up that basic training. What we have, that knowledge needs to be continually improved, grown, and reinforced through regular practice by working all the time at it. And in order to actually support a full-time specialist, this has to be an occupation generally by which one earns a living. Of course, there are some exceptions to this. Some lucky people can afford to be professionals just as a hobby, but that's generally not the case. So this, as I said, these characteristics can actually be applied to a very broad range of practices. Just because a techne may not meet all of these criteria, but it may still, on balance, be regarded as a techne. by meeting many or majority of those criteria. But techni should be distinguished from certain other phenomena and practices, and I would call these higher order concepts. Because in a sense, we need to think of concepts being in a hierarchy. Techne is not the end of life. It is not the end of the good life of a political community. So there are things that are, in a sense, above techne, which techne serves. And these are things, and there are also things to which techne can be compared, to which techne imitate, or indeed, in studying these higher order concepts, we can use techne as a basic paradigm, a basic model. So these are things like nature, physis, chance, chuker, or more importantly for our purposes, things like virtue, arete, or political or practical wisdom, political deliberation, which is how the Greek term phronesis is generally translated. So now we come to the question of the role of techne in society. We were asking earlier, what is the role of expertise in the modern world? Well, and the modern political world? Well, what is the role of techne in the ancient society? Well, the ancient society has a series of aims, of ends, and these are arranged, at least in the minds of the philosophers, in a hierarchy. We start off with the most necessary, the ankai techni, who are producing your basic needs. So, for example, in the Plato's Republic, Book 2, we have the basic technitai, who are the four first craftsmen, the carpenter, the farmer, and the shoemaker and the weaver, and these provide your basic aims of food, shelter, and clothing. But techne is not a one thing. It's not a homogeneous set of practices. There are practices which are more complex, and there are practices which aim at a higher aim. So it's a mistake often of ancient historians to ask, well, what was the status of work in ancient society? Well, that can simply be answered by another question. What type of work are you talking about, and in what context? So as I've said, within this overall category, we have the small basic techni versus the larger, more complex techni, and those which aim at higher ends. So we're thinking here of politics, politicaire. We're thinking here of the art of the statesman, and also the art of the one who is wise as well. We're ending with greater wisdom. Now, techne, of course, is an intellectual excellence, as Aristotle makes clear in the Nicomachean Ethics, but that's not the same as a moral excellence. But it may contribute to the moral excellence. So by knowing about medicine, you can become a good doctor, and that is a form of excellence. Of course it is. It's a form of virtue, but that doesn't necessarily make you a good human being. It does to a certain extent, though, because if you could use your medical knowledge to start killing people and start killing your patients. There are plenty of examples of that happening. But at that point, you would be leaving off the art of healing. You would be turning to something else, and that you would be starting on a negative pattern, which would mean that you lose that desire to continually improve. And in falling off from that practice, you would decline as a medical practitioner. But nonetheless, we still have two different things. The doctor is not the same as the good man or good woman, but they may overlap. Well, the problem is that we can pursue techne, and we may pursue it for quite a while, but we may still not end in virtue. Um, Even, and this is true of all the techni. This is true of even very complex techni, such as mathematics, very complex forms of mathematics. It is true even of politicae, of statesmanship, of strategicae, of generalship. Um, these kinds of things, even if you can spend all of your time fighting a war or trying to cure people, and it will only lead to a kind of not wisdom but monomania, and myopia. But on the other hand, there is another trap, and that is that the pursuit of knowledge without the techni, without that basis of basic knowledge, or without recourse to the expertise of people who have the basic knowledge, um, uh, will end in faulty knowledge, in false knowledge, in sophistry, effectively. Um, And this is the reason for the craft analogy. This is the reason for the obsession of the philosophers, or at least the Socratic philosophers, with techne. They are always going back to our your basic technites, and saying, is virtue, for example, is nature similar in some way to the work of this technites? And that is because we're looking eventually, the eventual aim is to gain a knowledge of things like virtue or politics, which is as reliable as the knowledge of a shoemaker, that a shoemaker can have 100% success rate in both making shoes and in teaching people to be shoemakers. A philosopher does not have that success rate. Socrates still taught Critias. Many of the academicians became tyrants. Does that mean that philosophers are in fact less successful and less useful than shoemakers? Well, no, it doesn't. Not exactly. And there is a reason for this. We look at the most honorable and most complex types of skill are what we might call the architectonic types of skill. This is like an architect. An architect is not someone who just knows how to polish a column and is focused narrowly on polishing that column. The architect has the overall paradigm, has the overall paradigm model of the temple that needs to be built, and has knowledge of all of the different processes that will need to go into making that temple, and has the knowledge that will enable him to authoritatively command all of the craftsmen which are working on this overall project. So that is what an architectonic kind of umbrella techne is, and that's what high forms of knowledge, Sophia, are. The same would be true of sculpture. The amount of knowledge that is required to produce something like Phidias's Chris Elephantine's statue of Athena, the knowledge of goldsmithing, of use of ivory, of design, of artistry, all of this huge amount of knowledge is required. It is very much the top end of the hierarchy of techne. But at the bottom end, we have forms of knowledge which can be described as banausia. And banausia is the opposite of paideia, of education. Now, what does this term banausia mean? Well, it refers, it's often taken to mean that it mean artisan craft. It's often imagined to mean something like smithing, or being a carpenter, and sometimes, on at least a couple of occasions, Aristotle and Xenophon do indicate that the Banausic techni are carpentry, are shoemaking, for example. But that's not fundamentally what Banausia is. It just so happens that certain practitioners of small crafts are Banausoi. It's not that Banausia means artisan craft. And this is a point which was made very strongly, for example, in a 2015 monograph by Felix Burio. But Burio did not explain why, nonetheless, artisan crafts are often associated with Banausia. And to understand this, we need to appreciate the effect of the division of labor. And for this, we can go again to Adam Smith. And Adam Smith notes that, of course, the division of labor increases the skill and dexterity of individual craftsmen, because the more time you spend on a particular task, the better you become at it. And this is exactly the same idea which is held by Plato, for example, and the other Socratic philosophers. However, there is such a thing as an excessive division of labor. So that Adam Smith says in Wealth of Nations 4.3, in the progress of the division of labor, in many cases, the worker, I quote, comes to be confined to a very few simple operations. So it becomes the craft becomes not architectonic, not simply specialized, but very, very excessively highly specialized. And why is that the case? It's because these simple operations are very easy to teach, that you can be easily and quickly trained in a simple operation. And by doing it over and over again, you become very fast at it. It's the kind of thing you would want to train your slave in, because it can be, again, low cost of training and very easy to supervise. You can easily measure productivity. You can say, how many shoes have you made this morning? This is your quota. Stick to your quota. Well, the result of having to do these kind of small repetitive actions again and again, according to Adam Smith, has, and I quote, no occasion or offers no occasion for this worker to exert his understanding or to exercise his invention. And so he generally becomes as stupid and as ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. And here Adam Smith is basically describing Banausia and the condition of the Banausos. It's not that Aristotle is being a class snob. It's not that he simply doesn't like artisans and lower class people. He's concerned that the work of these individuals leaves no room for intellectual or physical development. And moreover, that they are not aiming at a higher ergon, but they're aiming at only one thing, and that is money, to make a return, again, through making as many shoes as one can possibly do, to increase one's profits. These people are, as Plato would say in the Republic, using the metaphor of the cave, they are looking downwards. They're looking at simple things, basic things, basic money. So they basically have the values and the education, the paideia, not just of lower class people, but of the oligarchs. The oligarchs is outlined in Republic 8, who are only concerned with money. And this again, so if you spend all your time trying to earn money and fixate only on making money, you generally will probably become quite rich. And this is why, as Aristotle acknowledges in the Politics, many of the Banausoi are in fact rich. So we cannot regard Banausia as a characteristic of a particular social class, the artisans, the working class, or anything like that. They're not a propertied class. They are a moral class. And they are a class who have become morally and intellectually and also physically deficient because of the nature of their work, of their professions. But of course, the philosophers do not, in fact, define or they do not list usually banausic professions. It's kept deliberately vague. And again, this is because it's a moral term, because many artists, the sculptors, for example, even potters, as we can see from the evidence of 6th century black figure or early red figure vase painting, could to a certain extent live a life of leisure, could gain a certain paideia, especially because of the large number of, say, holidays and festivals in the ancient world, and also because many of these craftsmen were slave owners, and slavery provided a certain leisure in society, whereas, according to Aristotle, the slave has no leisure. Banausia aims at, well, it results in a very narrow focus, downward focus, whereas paideia aims to make an individual education, aims to make a student look up, to look up at the forms, to the ideas, to gain a deep knowledge of a wide range of subjects, and to look at knowledge, not necessarily knowledge for knowledge's sake, but certainly there is no immediate gain there's no immediate learning outcome from knowledge. What this life is, the life of scolaire. And this is not leisure. This is not just the ability to have free time, and particularly free time to devote to the life of the aristocrat, to being in politics, to warfare, to hunting or whatever. This is rather the quality of being able to stop and think, the ability to live the life of contemplation. And it is contemplation and the happiness that comes from contemplation, which is the very aim and purpose of the political life, the good life created by the polis, according to Aristotle. And this scolaire, this ability to stop and think, is the absolute opposite of busyness, the busyness of the polypragmon. And that can be the busyness of someone who is spending all of his time a slave, working over 300 days a year, probably around 16 hours a day in a factory. Or it could be the busyness of an orator, of a jobbing demagogue or sycophant, or a toiling general. It is the philosophers. The philosophers are complacent in their view of their value within society, not because they accept a hierarchy in which the aristocrats are at the top of the hierarchy. Their complacency is due to their hierarchy, their understanding the hierarchy in which the life of contemplation and the ability to pursue virtue is at the top of the hierarchy, and that's where they are, according to themselves, at any rate. Well, let's have a brief look at this point at the functioning of the philosophical schools and the first philosophical schools, and then perhaps we can compare this with our modern universities in a moment. Well, the first philosophical schools have often been viewed sometimes as almost kind of aristocratic associations, rather than modern universities, and they did indeed involve a lot of aristoi in them. But we still need to differentiate between the philosophers and the aristoi proper, because the philosophers were effectively a subgroup who were effectively parasitic on the aristoi. They lived, or they were able to study because of the grants of land, the fees, the gifts from the aristoi, from their pupils and from their friends. And in return, so they avoid the accusation of being mere flatterers because they provide a service. And they do this because they are nurturing the young men, the rich young men, the future leaders of society. And they're doing it by not just training them in a particular technical art of politics, but at least from the perspective of the academy, at any rate, they are encouraging them to look up, to be enlightened, to enlighten their souls. So this is why I think there is no evidence, despite attempts at reconstructions, there's no real evidence of anything like a lecture course or a series of, or a curriculum, or a program of learning in any of our early philosophical schools. They are not giving technical learning. They're aiming, as the author of the Platonic seventh letter, I still tend to think this is Plato himself. They're trying to light a spark, and this is through a process of constant friction. The philosopher can't create that spark through himself, but it can continually be sort of pushing and causing that friction, which will light a fire within the soul of the pupil. And this, of course, requires huge effort on the part of the pupil. It's not just the teacher. The teacher cannot do it himself. The pupil therefore needs exemplary natural abilities, and also determination, the will to become better and to learn, even when the learning doesn't seem to directly lead to the thing, that the overall end goal, that is making one a good person. The philosophers were, in fact, not politicians themselves, but they were segregated and devoted to scolaire. But they did have a political role, nonetheless, and a political function. But their role was different to that of the politicians. They were political as advisors, but not just to advisors as to the demos of their own cities, as was the case with the orators, but they could be advisors to a international elite, which was much more broad than just their own city. And they could also act, and they did regularly act, as ambassadors. And again, they were pleading the case on behalf of their own city, or potentially also other cities as well. But the two things they never do, or very rarely do, is move decrees as orators, and to act as generals. And they rarely are logographers, although Isocrates claimed not to have written speeches, but he seems to have done in at least a few cases. But these individuals can be contrasted with the politicians, who, what they don't do is that they don't have any students and they don't write books. So these are the two things which specifically are what philosophers do. So I would argue that philosophers were a profession, in the sense that they were a group of individuals who had a common identity through the practice of a specialist skill, and a function, education, which provided a benefit to society and from which they obtained a living. And we have some details of the living that they obtained. So we can look at the philosophers' wills, which are given to us by Diogenes Laertius, and which are almost certainly genuine. And Aristotle, for example, had a very large set of assets worth around about, I reckon it's around about 3 to 4 talents, depending on how you calculate it. But there's very little evidence that this was inherited wealth. He certainly had a house, and a bit of land in Stagira, which came from his father. But his father was not an aristocrat. His father, again, was a professional. He was a doctor. And there's very little evidence for slaves employed, for example, in factories, very large tracts of land. But what we do have is the certain fact that these people were given gifts and given fees. So according to Philodemus, for example, Epicurus lived not from agriculture, and he didn't live from owning slaves. he lived off the gifts given in gratitude to him by members of the school at the garden, or former members of the school at the garden. He lived off his friends. Um, uh, but that's a little bit of a digression. So I'm going to return now to the topic which I started with, which is the problems of today, and how some of these concepts may, I hope, bring a little bit of clarity to those problems. So I began by noticing some of the issues connected with the knowledge economy. And I noticed in particular that we are seeing an increasing process of professionalization of accreditation, but at the same time, a minimalization of what might be called empirical knowledge. This is knowledge gained from everyday experience by spending a lot of time on the ground dealing with a particular set of problems. So, for example, we are seeing police officers who are becoming more and more professionalized, and that they are in many countries, such as Sweden, they now have to have academic degrees, but they can't do basic things like firing guns or driving cars after suspects. At least this is the complaint of the older generation of police officers. And empiria is, of course, a part of techne, which is potentially being lost. It's not sufficient. Empiria is not sufficient for techne in itself, but it is the basic component of it. And the result of when techne is separated from empiria, the end result is sophistry. We also see we're seeing a movement of resources away from workers to professionals, as I mentioned, or in reality, these people are not professionals. I'll explain the difference in a moment, but I would say that they are managers rather. And this is particularly true of professions such as HR, of human resources. We can see a need to improve the status of what is a relatively simple, relatively low status, low knowledge profession. And it's work that's often very unrewarding. But we're seeing that this basic kind of management is increasingly overvalued. It's leading to higher pay and higher numbers of resources channeled towards it. And this, of course, is a deliberate strategy. It's an aim to increase budgets. It's an aim to increase the numbers of people that bosses are managing, which again increases the salaries and the status of those bosses. Then the second point that we raised was the place of expertise in politics. Now, of course, we could return at this moment to a text such as Plato's Protagoras, which noted that in Athens, in the demos, whenever a technical question came about, we would have a expert brought forward, and it was only that expert who could speak. Whereas, of course, on a more political, general deliberation, anyone at all could speak. Now, Socrates suggests that this is something odd about democracy, but I think particularly when we turn to Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics and his division between techne and phronesis, we can see very clearly that the Greeks could understand that the authority of the technetes stops at the limit of the techne. The techne is carefully defined because it is a specialist skill. So there is a need to prevent the as it were, kind of empire building. The belief, which is attested, for example, in Plato's Apology, that oh well, if I know I'm a very good shoemaker, I've therefore achieved something, I've gained a knowledge, so that means that I can be knowledgeable in other areas as well. And I think it's important in a democracy to recognize that in many cases, as far as political questions are concerned, experts may know no more than the man on the street. So we need to distinguish between techne and phronesis. We also need to deal with the problem of technocracy. Now, the idea of a technocrat suggests that this is knowledge of a wide range of techni. This is effectively the rule of the technitai, as opposed to democracy, the rule of the demos. But I would suggest that this is mistaken. What, in fact, a technocracy is not a technocracy. It is in that sense, anyway, it is a bureaucracy. And the techne, there is only one techne, and it is the techne of management, which the bureaucracy practices. Which brings us on to the issue of the crisis, what I've called the crisis of professions. Now, this crisis has been brought about for two reasons. Firstly, it is due to technology. AI, also before that, the internet, other forms of technology are likely to obliterate forms of human expertise, much in the same way as the mechanical loom abolished artisan skills during the Industrial Revolution. And Karl Marx, of course, pointed out in his Communist Manifesto and other works the deep social problems caused by this effective enslavement of the independent artisan, the independent technites, within a large factory to the big boss, a situation, of course, which did not pertain in ancient Greece, and which makes Marxist models such as those espoused by historians such as de Saint-Croix rather difficult to apply to the ancient world. But what we are seeing today is something not entirely something that might be analogous to this destruction of the status of the individual artisan, but it is now being applied to the professions. This is the growth of bureaucracy. Well, if the professions are in crisis, we may as well ask briefly, what is a profession? And some may say that the profession is a modern idea. Now, I've referred to the ancient philosophers, for example, as a profession. So you may want to object at this point that, well, a profession is a modern concept. Well, I don't think that's actually true. What we call a profession is today, in the context of the modern world, is indeed a modern phenomenon. It has come about because of a particular historical process. What we are talking about is a type of work, a type of skilled work, or indeed the organization of skill and expertise, which superseded both the craft guilds and also the church in the medieval period. The church, of course, a center for non-craft learning and patron of craft learning, has been replaced by the universities and then steadily driven out of the universities. So the professions are developing slowly from the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. It's not a phenomenon which is connected with industrialization. It starts happening a lot earlier than industrialization. But often we think of the great age of professions as the 19th century, the early 20th century, when the main professional associations really are entrenched and organized on a much more systematic basis to encourage greater professional development, greater education and training of the professions and professionals. There is, of course, a major difference between the ancient form of professions, as I've outlined them, and modern professions. And this is that modern professions have been steadily institutionalized through the development of professional associations, which are not present in ancient Athens of the classical period, and only they do have some existence in antiquity, but that's a question we can avoid for the moment. And that these modern professions, so they're not only institutionalized, but they're also bureaucratized. So it is bureaucracy that, according to Max Weber, is the key characteristic of modern societies, not the professions. Where the modern professions are modern, it is because is where they are similar to bureaucracies. But forms of professions can be found in pre-modern societies as well. So what is what is bureaucracy? Well, I'm not going to go through all of Weber's criteria for bureaucracy, but one of the most important things is to note is that a bureaucracy is hierarchically structured. There is, he has in mind, for example, the modern civil service, that this is an institution where there are clear, defined grades of promotion, and you work your way up these grades of promotion through merit, through examination, for example. This is not the same as a bureaucracy of a patrimonial monarchy or some kind of charismatic leader where these offices are given because of your connection, your relationship with the ruler. This is something very different. So it's very hierarchical, and not hierarchical in the sense of, I said, there's a hierarchy of value or honor earlier in terms of professions, but hierarchical in the sense that they are top down. The orders, the initiatives are all coming from the top and cascading. There we go. We've got a modern management term there, cascading down the hierarchy. So that's essentially the main difference between a bureaucracy and a profession, because a profession is structured differently. A profession is structured based on specialist knowledge, and it is a network of different professions and different professionals who all know different things and all have roughly equal status on the basis of that knowledge. So think, for example, of an Oxford or Cambridge college, a collegium, which is a gathering not of employees and employers, but of fellows joined in a collegium or a societas. They're equals to each other. Now, of course, some fellows, the older ones, the wiser ones, know a lot more than other fellows. But even the oldest, the master of the college, may know a great deal, but he will not necessarily know the same things as the most junior member of the senior common room. And that is the difference between the hierarchical and the more network system of, respectively, the bureaucracy and the profession. Now, I mentioned that the bureaucracy has a set of skills in which its members are examined and trained in, but they are only in one aspect, one narrow aspect of life, which is the skill pertaining to management, or and these may include skills, knowledge to do with jurisprudence, let's say, but also the knowledge of how the bureaucracy itself works, how things can be done, what are the procedures and processes of that bureaucracy. and it is very bound by laws and institutions and rules. And this was another key criterion of Weber. And members of that bureaucratic hierarchy, of course, have to follow the rules. That is a clear, definite difference, which is recognized, for example, by Plato in his Statesman, where he paradoxically says that the statesman, and the statesman, remember, is a technites. The statesman is a craftsman, a demiurge, effectively. The statesman effectively can disobey the law. And this is a very strange thing because, of course, elsewhere, Plato very much emphasizes that the ruler must rule in accordance with the laws, kata nomus. So he has to explain what he means here in some details. And he says that, well, because the politikos is a craftsman, the craftsman must be autonomous. The craftsman can only be corrected by another craftsman because it is specialist knowledge. So a doctor is the only person who can correct another doctor or can discipline another doctor. Technitae have to be autonomous. They have to regulate themselves or each other. And law and regulation cannot or should not restrain or guide their work. We shouldn't have a top-down process. Indeed, Plato says or rather the Eleatic Stranger says at 299e, clearly all the arts would be ruined, nor could they ever rise again through the operation of the law prohibiting investigation, and so life which is hard enough now would then become absolutely unendurable. Well, is this the condition in which we currently find ourselves? Well, you might respond that, in fact, the bureaucratic system is to be preferred because it is efficient. And this indeed is what Weber believed was the key to a modern society's efficiency. And to a certain extent, that is correct, at least as long as bureaucracy is not pursued as an end in itself, as long as the bureaucracy doesn't start trying to work for itself rather than from any other end in serving whoever it is that it is serving, whether that's the public, the demos, or whether that is academics and students within a university. So we have actually, I fear, reached a perverse situation where democracy lacks an ergon, or indeed its function becomes itself and its own existence. So it lacks the function which is an essential part of tekner. Or rather, it has an ergon, a function that is neither basic, that is, that is necessary. It is not providing any necessary need. It's not putting food on the table. It's not building houses. But it's also not a higher order function. It isn't cultivating virtue. It isn't creating happiness. It isn't organizing. It isn't furthering the good order, eunomia, of our societies. The next point is that it is a supreme irony of the knowledge economy that bureaucracies, in fact, usually lack knowledge, and they come if they develop to an excessive degree, they come to lack the ability to even gain knowledge or to organize that knowledge. And this is a point that's emphasized particularly by Friedrich von Hayek, where he showed that what matters is the small knowledge, the knowledge of effectively of the individual trader in a market, decentralized knowledge, which comes about due to the division of labor, so that the planner, the centralized planner, cannot know what the individual market trader knows. Now, of course, the individual market trader doesn't know what the planner knows either, but the individual market trader is part of an overall market price system that it is a bit like how Xenophon explains the working of the Spartan phalanx. He says it works very simply because effectively the man in the phalanx knows the person to the right, the person in front, the person to the left, and as they move, I will move as well. The market works in the same way. As prices go up, as demand goes up, we find a way to fill that demand. This is Hayek's idea anyway. Now, management has a rather different purpose to either the fulfilling of an ergon, of an end or a function, or indeed the development of knowledge, the pursuit of truth. Management, of course, has as its purpose organization, the imposition of a hierarchy, and efficient management requires not ideally, the easiest way to make management efficient is to make workers not knowledgeable, but to make them stupid. Now, by stupid, I'm not saying literally unintelligent or naturally unintelligent, but I'm using the concept developed by the organizational theorist Mats Alvesson, the idea of functional stupidity. Now, he was studying in particular very sort of management consultancy firms, very much white-collar city firms, where they often employ highly intelligent people. But the structure, the management structure, is aimed not to cultivate that intelligence, not to cultivate knowledge, but in some ways to make these people stupid, functionally stupid. So it does this by emphasizing not the need for knowledge, but the need for certainty. It wants to narrow the focus of these individuals, these professionals. They are not interested in knowledge why, they're interested in knowledge that, to use a paraphrase Aristotle. So essentially this is the boss wants this to be done, or this has to be done, this is what we are doing, rather than considering why we should do it, or is this a good outcome? This is particularly the case when thinking about, well, why do people like management consultants work ridiculously long hours? Often it's not actually about providing a better service for the client. Does the client really need exhausted and wired professionals? But it is a good management strategy. It makes these individuals, it gives them a sense, an ethos that they're part of a group that is an elite group because they can do it. They can do 15-hour days because they're not like weak, lazy people. So that's very good. It bonds them together as a group. And it also prevents them from thinking, because people who are very busy can't think, in the same way that Aristotle says a slave has no leisure. And in fact, many people who have been in high-powered city jobs often describe their life as a life as an effective slave. So when you're constantly working hard, when you're constantly being told, do this, do that, the aim is to avoid you questioning policies, and particularly questioning policies of members of a higher hierarchy. So it self-imposes discipline. It promotes discipline within the structure. So this is why it's functional stupidity. It's not a stupid idea. It's in some ways, a very sensible management strategy, but it is not a management strategy that encourages intellectual and spiritual growth. It encourages actually the opposite, because it has another aim involved. And in doing so, it draws on very early management theory. We can go back, for example, to Frederick Taylor's very short book, The Principles of Scientific Management, published in 1911, where he criticized what he called inefficient rule of thumb methods and old systems of management in common use that makes it imperative for each workman shall be left with the final responsibility for doing his job practically as he thinks best. The idea he had for improving productivity was to separate the workers from the managers. The managers are the ones who do the thinking. The workers should not be left to think. This is not just because he wanted to control the workers or because he hated them. This was an aim to improve working conditions for working people. At least that was how it was presented in the book. But he believed that productivity, economic growth, and so on could be bettered when the management, he says that the management must take over and perform much of the work which is now left to the men. Now, this has negative results. It results in the loss of autonomy, the loss of initiative, because you're only doing what the boss says, and the loss of that decentralized knowledge described by Hayek, the loss of what the individual GP, the individual bank manager, not that bank managers exist anymore, what these people know about particular cases. All of that small knowledge is lost and replaced with technical knowledge. Now, Taylor was talking about techniques which were being applied to the working classes in factories, but these techniques are now effectively being applied to the professions, and including the universities. And this is the pursuit of and the belief that technical knowledge, scientific knowledge, is superior to other forms of knowledge. But we have a difficulty here, the difficulty of applying simple technical knowledge to larger problems, and also the difficulty of applying scientific knowledge to moral or political problems. For example, we may know that climate change is warming the earth. That is probably the case. I think we can probably demonstrate that scientifically. But what is the political solution to this? That is a question of deliberation, in which you cannot simply follow the science. The technites speaks to the assembly and then sits down. At that point, it is the moment of deliberation on the basis of what has already been said by the technites as evidence. The similarly perverse application of science to moral and political problems has led to the obsession of training, where bureaucracies are effectively training their employees in morality. And this is, I think, very much the realm of EDI, where if you are trying to make someone racist or not racist, this is a moral question and a case of moral education, which cannot simply be boiled down to a training module. But that's a bigger question, and we'll avoid that for the moment, or perhaps we can return to it. But I'm now just going to, sorry, I've been talking for too long, but I'm very quickly going to return to the main subject of this lecture series, which is, well, what is the future of classics? Well, I think Aristotle would have recognized tendencies in the modern workplace and in the modern university as quite simply banausia. And he would also have recognized the same tendencies in the modern management consultancy firm as banausia also, even though it is the work of management consultants or bankers and market traders rather than the work of shoemakers and carpenters. I think he would only be surprised that institutions whose very function is the broadening of the mind, or at least was originally the broadening of the mind, are now working actively to close the minds in pursuit of functional stupidity. that modern universities are now effectively corrupt. They have a false techne, which is kolakeia, which is flattery, and this is the flattery that Plato is so critical of, or Socrates is so critical of in Plato's Gorgias, which is aimed not at the benefit of clients or students, but at pleasing them. It is empiria or triber. It is, and this is not a criticism, I believe, particularly of empirical work, but rather a criticism of the of sophistry, the aim of not having a fixed aim or ergon, but of simply wishing to please people and of working here and there as best serves the moment to keep people, to keep students happy, or to keep the government happy, whatever has to be done to keep people happy just for a moment. The aim of many universities is to produce a docile and functionally stupid members of the workforce. This is employability. We are designing our students to effectively work in a bureaucracy. They are to be trained, but they are not to be educated. They are to be trained to do a narrow focus on set tasks and processes, and we are essentially only concerned with money. That is the other aspect of employability. We are only interested not in creating human beings, but in creating the people who can fill in spreadsheets. Where is the future of classics going to be in all of this? I think we need to return very simply to a humanism, and this is not just the humanism of the 14th and 15th centuries, but of the Greeks. We need to emphasize the importance of techne as a basis for this work. So this is why in classics, the languages, technical skills such as epigraphy, numismatics, etc., are so important. But they are not enough in themselves. They're not the end in themselves. Latin does not make you a good person, but it's a good place to start. As the former headmaster of Harrow School said, my aim is to make you Christians first, Christians first, gentlemen second, and scholars third. But being a scholar, even at the bad third, is still the starting place, and it's our job, and we have to keep doing that job, even if we are being hindered at it at the same time. We must go on regardless. So the key thing is to know and learn and to want to learn and to want to look up, to look at the forms, to look at beauty, virtue, goodness. And we cannot teach these things. That is not possible. But we are working on sparking, putting the spark, the flame of inspiration into our students. And we want to teach them to live a life of contemplation, even when outside the university. We do need modern philosophers, but we also need the Alcibiades and the Alexanders of this world. We need to seduce them with knowledge and virtue, not with ourselves, but with knowledge and virtue, and make them lovers of wisdom, so that they can go out into a life of business and politics and nonetheless support us with their fees, but support us also in the political life as well. And we want them to have that give them the means to live a life of contemplation, to live a broad life, a life of enlightenment, even when they're busy, even when they're orators on the Bema or they are traders at their tables. To always have that spark of contemplation, and also to go back to the grove of the academy, to sit and rest from toil in Epicurus's garden, or to walk, as once before, by the banks of the Ilissus' waters, arm in arm with Socrates. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmund. This very rich, interesting lecture. So now we have some time for the Q&A. So if anyone wants to turn on the camera and ask a question or pick up some point in the lecture, now is the time. Yeah, there were, well, let's start off. There was so many points you made, and really there is a lot to talk about here. But one of the my overall points is I think it touches upon a similar question that Ian McGilchrist is talking about, namely this left hemispheric, very narrow, very abstract uh, way of looking at the world, which is filled with certainty, but not with intelligence and real curiosity, and this right hemispheric kind of attention, which is open to possibilities, which is flexible, sort of intuitively curious about stuff and concrete. Uh, I think indeed it's a very pernicious phenomenon uh, where people are just trained in this very abstract way, which is divorced from the experience of life and of the world. Uh, and I was when you mentioned uh, the role of the techneti in the democratic deliberation and all of that. I recently there was something which I thought was kind of thought-provoking. Whatever people think about that, one of the candidates for running for the office of president in Poland, he was asked by some young person, an adolescent, about some climate policies, something like that. And the candidate said, it's not the matter of opinion. This is the matter of education. So basically the candidate he said, there is no room for discussion. It's not the case that you can have, you young man, you can have your opinion and I can have my opinion as president, or the minister for climate can have his or her opinion. No, it's just education. So go to people who educate and they will tell you
Mm,
everything to think.
yeah.
So I think it's philosophically very interesting, although not in a very good way, because you might say, well, what is the realm of opinion? You can go to generals and they will tell you whether to start a war or not. You're not allowed to have opinions about economy. Just go to an economist. He will tell you what to think. You cannot have an opinion about poetry. Just go to a literature professor at the faculty, and he will tell you what to think. So, I mean, if we follow this road, we end up in not only functional stupidity, but this absolute blank state of mind where you are not allowed to have any opinion. You're not allowed to be intelligent. You just have to be educated, which is kind of like this totalitarian Orwellian almost vision. So, which brings me to a point which I think is it's very harmonious with what you were talking today about. I mean, uh, Chesterton he said something very up to the point, of course, about education. So he said something like that we love to talk about education, but really it's just to avoid uh, talking about what is good, what is the good, because Chesterton said something like, we cannot decide what is good in our society, but let us give it to our children, because it seems like in at the universities, but everywhere really, we are teaching skills which are completely divorced from telos, from what is it that is supposed to be the end of this activity? So, for instance, we are teaching people to think critically, but what about? I mean, and what are the conclusions from this process of thinking? Or people are taught to write creatively, but write what exactly? And so what is the end product of this? Or in a certain university in a certain country, um, I will make it a universal anecdotal thing. So a company publishing journal, let's say a scientific journal, this company approached this certain university and said, if you pay us money, we will train your professors how to publish in our journal. We are selling this skill. So now we want to train people how to publish, just publish, but publish what? Exactly. What about what? So people are trained to to educate, but educate whom? About what? To manage, but manage whom? So this is completely abstract. The procedures are completely divorced from the telos and also from someone who does that. Everyone is a different person. The way you teach Greek is different from the way I teach Greek and the way Dobrinka teaches Greek. So the idea that there is just one way to teach anyone, just bring people to me, I will teach whatever you want. So, I mean, the level of generality and abstraction becomes just, you think you're reading Hegel at a certain point. It's just pure abstractions. And I think you showed that in Plato and Aristotle, they are still thinking about concrete, life experiences. There is a concrete thing you are supposed to produce, make, treat this person, make a sculpture of a god, build a house. I think we need that. And I don't know what you think about my little rant here.
No,
uh,
I agree entirely with everything you said. I mean, I think you pointed out the the exact problem that it is this emphasis on technical learning. So why you have to be educated? It's not, you're not actually being educated, and this is the twisting of the word. You're being trained. Um, so you're being trained in what you need to know. And it is a totalitarian, or it is something that does appear in totalitarian states. So this is effectively mind control, or rather thought reform, to use the term that from Maoist China. Um, but of course, this kind of behavior is not found purely in totalitarian states. Indeed, all forms of, I mean, it's common for all forms of organization, even in schools. I mean, a school's purpose is uh, to a certain extent, build a particular way of thinking and build a particular type of person. But of course, it doesn't do it to an excessive length. It also leaves, it's also wanting to create, ideally, if it's a good school, is ideally to create human flourishing. Think of sort of Dead Poet Society. There's that tension between the creation of a particular type of person, or with a particular way of thinking about things, and the tension with wanting to create a knowledgeable, intelligent, thinking human being. But yes, I think in all of these sorts of, but it is an authoritarian tendency, and it's an authoritarian tendency that someone like Hayek very much noticed. And I think you can see a clear link between his work on knowledge and and his warnings in the Road to Serfdom, that this lack of awareness of the importance of small forms of knowledge, um, this disconnected forms of knowledge, um, is giving planners, central planners, an authority which they don't actually have, which is of course clear to everyone on the ground. Everyone can see how stupid often a lot of enforced policies from above. This is something that we complain about on a day-to-day basis, and it's true of not just in our sector but in many others. Is everything is coming from above, and no one is interested in what the clear no one is interested in, is this going to be a good outcome? It's just what we have to do. So yeah, it's entirely losing any kind of telos. I think that's exactly right. But yes, sorry, I've basically been repeating myself, but in answering your
Here,
question, I don't think I
I'll
said
just
you there.
yeah, I'll just read two reactions from participants that left, and a question from the Brinka. So Jakub Filonik wrote, "I'm afraid I have to run, but thank you for a brilliant, thought-provoking talk." And Alice Landskron, "Thank you so much for this complex and multifaceted talk on professions." Um, and a message on chat from Dobrinka Shiekova. "Excellent lecture, Edmund, even if depressing, is one of the reasons for the valuation of expertise and knowledge, that they necessarily require a great investment of time and effort to acquire. So they, in our modern culture, are seen like waste of time, money. Is it even possible to reverse the value system?"
I think that's right. And I think this is where training modules come in. It's very easy to quickly learn something, to be trained in something, and to add that to your CV. But actually, that doesn't really mean that you've really learned anything. I mean, someone who's really skilled at a particular skill, it's a lifetime's work, to become a craftsman in a particular thing. So I think a lack of that we're always worried about this decline in our in the amount of time we spend on something, and yeah, so I think that's right. Can it be reversed? I mean, I think ultimately I wouldn't say that. I don't think my intention was to depress. Um, I think ultimately there is plenty of grounds for hope because of what we are selling. Um, Ultimately, the system is designed to encourage a certain behavior, which is to just encourage employability. Um, uh, and it's also designed to encourage people to the spend the least amount of effort possible in obtaining their education. Um, and I think it's ironic, for example, that I don't know whether anyone else has encountered this, but I was forced to be trained in teaching when I got my permanent job, which is ironic because I've been teaching for about 10 years at this stage. But I was nonetheless trained in teaching. And one of the things you learn from this training, this theory on education, is what they aim to do is to create a so-called deep learner, as opposed to surface learners. And surface learners, of course, do things only they learn to the test. They aim to get a qualification with the smallest amount of effort possible, and the main thing is getting the qualification. And they say, well, what you want to do is to create a deep learner, someone who's really effectively learns for his own sake. But that again is, you're trying to create effectively a virtue. You're trying to instill the virtue of wisdom into that person, the personal commitment and desire to learn. And that is something you cannot do as a teacher. So effectively, what our modern professors of education are claiming that they can do, like the ancient sophists, is to teach virtue. Not that they would put it that way, of course, but that's what they're effectively doing. But it is something like the ancient sophists that they cannot do, because no one who goes to any of these training programs ever does it with any aim in other than just passing the module. And they are not able to make anyone really interested in theories of education because it's fundamentally boring and stupid. But my point rather is, we're not so. Yeah, if
Yeah,
we
but there
assume,
is, I think there is a way to teach that, but not from the not it is not left hemispheric way. So, and you can find this in antiquity when, in philosophy, people say if you want to become a philosopher, you have to spend time with a philosopher. So go to Epicurus, or
yeah,
Seneca writes in his letters, if you want to be a philosopher, you have to become a friend of a philosopher. You have to spend time with him,
yeah,
watch him eat, watch him drink, watch him talk. And so, and now cognitive science
yeah,
proves effectively that we learn by being around people and incorporating these people into ourselves. But you cannot make a training module out of it because basically you teach by becoming this and then telling people, this is what I do, this is what I like, this is fun, this is beautiful, this is interesting. You can try to become like this as well, or not.
because
But
what you've described
yeah,
is
and then you have to make a syllabus out of this, a bullet points. It doesn't work like that. Yeah.
no, because that's it. We're focusing only on the technical aspects, not about the sort of long term habituation aspects of technair. But if you remove that, you don't have the technical skill. So it's like, because the technical skill is regarded as the most highly, to be respected. So you say, we'll just do that. We'll just train you in that, and then you lose the totality of the skill. It's kind of hollowed out techne, I think, which is why I think in Plato, when Socrates in the Gorgias criticizes Empiria, I think it's mainly he's getting at Polus, because Polus had this idea, idea that Empiria is connected with techne. But I think most people would agree with that, and I think Plato does agree that Empiria has an important role within techne. But yeah, that's exactly right. We're just, because after all, how do we? It's like teaching essay writing. Like, it's not something we have loads of sessions on how to write essays, and yes, you can, you can. It's being given a few hints and tips at the start is helpful, but the idea that you will be able to write an essay because you have gone to a how to write an essay session is absurd. You write an essay by writing essays over and over and over again. But the modern curriculum, which prioritizes things like diversity in assessments, is actually encouraging us not to do that, because students, they write an essay and then they design a poster and write a reflective statement, and then they write a blog post, and then they, do an exam maybe. So they don't build up these hours of doing all this practice and doing something. And I think we can see that across, and it's the general lack of decline of skills. But what I was going to say is that I don't think I wouldn't be too pessimistic, because ultimately people do want to learn. They don't. I think they're going to be, not everyone, but you will always find people you're always going to find, like, the Dions of this world, who despite living in a society that encourages the opposite of the pursuit of wisdom and virtue, they still want to learn. And it's only that this kind of perverse situation has only come about because of the particular historical circumstances that we are in, and the particular institutions which have been corrupted and are reinforcing this kind of behavior. If they were destroyed tomorrow and we started all over again, like they were in the end fall of the Roman Empire, we would eventually, get to Alcuin, and then we get to the Renaissance again, because I think that is the natural progression of human beings. So I don't think that corruption and decay is the only future for humanity.
Yeah, yeah. So we can end at at this optimistic note, which brings to mind the beginning of Aristotle's metaphysics, that all
Mm,
human beings by nature desire to know. So thank you, Edmund, for this lecture, and everyone for their presence here and listening to it and engaging in
and happy
this very
birthday.
interesting fourth part of our series. And the next time we will listen to David Butterfield's final closing lecture in the series. Okay, so thank you and goodbye.
Bye.